Hi, Bob Quinn here for Blue Poppy. We're recording this. We just thought it would be interesting have a conversation with Beth Hazzard, who teaches at OCOM. We used to be colleagues there. I then moved on to NUNM, the School of Classical Chinese Medicine. And number of topics come up as possibilities. Beth will soon be recording some continuing ed seminars with Blue Poppy. And we might touch on some of that, but I wanted to start talking about mentor, mentee, or some say disciple, master, sensei, deshi relationship. You had a very significant teacher, Pauline. She wasn't there from Sasaki. She wasn't there from day one. Her work she called quantum Shiatsu. I also have the experience of having had many teachers. That's my good fortune. But some of them have really hung on at like an ongoing relationship with me, where I get to see their work evolve. And I think over time you saw that happen in Pauline's work.
Yeah.
So maybe we start with you just talking about what was before, what was going on in your professional practice life before you encountered Pauline, and then how that changed and your recognition of her as your teacher, and then what her work evolved to.
Yeah.
So it's a big chunk.
Sure, I'm up for it. So let's see, I knew I wanted to study some type of East Asian body work when I had decided to go to massage school. I went to East West College and studied with Sandy Mullaney. You knew Sandy. And was instantly pretty enchanted. Now, I was not a natural at Shiatsu, and I think she often was like, what is this girl doing? I was just clumsy, but the energetics of it totally resonated. So I was willing to work hard and get good at it, and I try to remind my students of that because I can make it look easy now. Almost 30 years later, and I worked hard to get there, basically. Anyway, so I studied with her. I had a practice doing basically like kind of half and half Shiatsu and, Swedish deep tissue. And about 10 years in, I reached kind of a crossroads of saying, I felt like I was kind of like a body mechanic, It was like, I didn't really get into this to just kind of fix people's sore muscles and give them what I called the oily rub down, which I still find totally valuable. However, it was not where my deeper interests were. So I ended up deciding to go back and deepen my knowledge of Shiatsu. I actually was just kind of on my own during that time and figuring it out for myself. I was young, I graduated from East West when I was 21, so this was through my 20s. I was just kind of figuring it out, and I had other mentors in learning about subtle energy and meditation and other types of healing that I was working with. So I had a kind of another context within there. But then I had decided to study with Sandy again. She was offering kind of a refresher course in her office, so I would go once a week. Met some wonderful people that I was studying with there, and most of those people were very, very new to Shiatsu. And she started talking about, well, things have changed in how we're doing Shiatsu now. We're not just coming from this hara-based alignment, which is how she had taught it originally. She studied with Ohashi in New York. And she said, I'm studying with someone new named Pauline Sasaki, and now it's all about this spinal alignment. It's all about alignment. And I, was kind of like, okay, now I'm going to give you a side note, and this is kind of an out there story, but very interesting. Around this exact same time, I had decided to see a psychic, an intuitive woman who had come highly recommended. I went and saw her. I told her where I was and that what am I supposed to be doing here? And I felt a call to teach at some point. And she said, well, your guides, she would talk to your guides. She said, your guides keep showing me this symbol. And so it was like a cross like so, and then like so again. And then she said, and she says, they just keep saying it's in you, it's part of you. And they just keep saying the word alignment. Now, I hadn't had this conversation with Sandy yet, right? They just keep saying alignment, alignment, alignment. And they're like, they said, like, as you develop, it expands in multidimensionally, like spokes from a wheel, but it's coming out in all directions, right? So then when I go to study with Sandy, she's saying alignment, and it still didn't really ring a bell for some unknown. I feel that she was still trying to figure out what she was talking about, because it was such a new concept that it wasn't totally like clicking with me, right? So I go, then she says, well, Pauline is coming to town for the first time to teach here. And she hadn't really thought about me at the level where I was, that I might be a student. I said, well, I want to go and do this. So she said, oh yeah, of course. This is how I originally met Susan Hare and Shelley Wager. They were the ones facilitating Pauline coming to town. So I got to meet them, and I go to the workshop. She's teaching quantum shiatsu, and it's blowing my mind. And I'm like, okay, this is really cool. This is really cool. And it was a lot of people. And I would just remember feeling like, so much was going on in my mind as she's talking about it. And then she looks out at everybody and gets, like, it was like she was sort of frustrated that there were things that we weren't understanding. So she gets a piece of paper, and she goes, and she kept talking about the alignment, and she goes, look, it's like this. And she draws this exact symbol. She goes, it is like this, it is in you, like this, and like spokes from a wheel. It's like, and I was like, felt like I was the only person in the room, and like I couldn't even see straight. And I was like, okay, I am in the right place. So that was like the yes, a big yes. And it continues to feel that way for me. Like, this alignment is what, where we're really coming from in this work, and then everything that kind of came after that. So I studied with her. Every time she came to Portland and was practicing as much as I could, I was a very dedicated student. Every moment with her was very meaningful for me. I was just soaking it all up, right? And then I got to a point, it was actually Shelley Wager and I had decided to go and study in England at Shiatsu College of England. So that was Clifford Andrews and Carol Beresford Cook and Paul Lundberg, Dinah John, Nicola Lay, Nicola Pooley, who's now Nicola Lay. Nicola was part of that.
The webinar series.
Yes. So that was super exciting. So that was a 2-year program, and that was in that time frame I started to think that maybe acupuncture was maybe a next step. I was just like, I can't get enough of this stuff. So I think I should probably do that. And then right when I had decided in 1 year, I'm going to start this process of going to OCOM, Javier Preciado called and asked would I be his TA. So there's lots of little alignments that happened there. And then, so...
That's TA at OCOM.
At OCOM. So I had started TAing before. I had like a couple years. I had to do some prereqs and prepare. So I think I was TAing and then quickly teaching the advanced class, which was fun. So within about 1.5 years, I started teaching the advanced. And I taught advanced for a while before I started teaching the first year class for Shiatsu, which was actually... Sometimes it continues to be challenging for me. I love it, but I love it when I'm just like, yeah, just learn Shiatsu so we can go do this fun stuff. But anyway, yeah, so that was like a lot of different synchronicities. So after studying I really loved what was happening at Shiatsu College of England, because Cliff had been had mentored with, or, had apprenticed, I suppose, with Pauline for quite a few years. Right. And really understood her work as it had evolved before I even had met her. And then he kind of evolved into his own person with his work, but really wanted to bridge in some of what felt like more out there ideas and kind of link them back in and kind of build them in through the basic Zen Shiatsu model, and then into linking in where she had gone with it. So that was really great to have all of that kind of integration, I suppose. And then I finally decided that I needed to go and start studying with her more in depth.
Beyond her coming here to Portland.
Beyond. So that's when I decided to go to the Zendo, which was that was a place called Zendo Daibosatsu in upstate New York. Her parents were involved in building that Zen monastery and were friends with the Roshi. And so it was this I couldn't believe I was allowed to do this in a way, but we stayed in the guest house. She'd known this the Roshi since she was a child, I assume. And they had a very cute relationship. And so we would get up and do Zen services in the morning, but she had decided that at this point we would do part of the Zen services seated on the floor in the main hall, and then this next part we would go into our own room in the temple or whatever it was. Was it a temple?
I think.
Yeah, we would go into our own room and sit in chairs and work on a different type of alignment that she felt came from the Egyptians. And that she would crawl around on the floor and line us up. And he at one point asked her when we were we were having tea with him, what were you doing? I saw you crawling around, Pauline. And so she said, well, I'm having them sit like this, and it's because of the Egyptians, and it's part of the alignment. And he says, where did you get this information? And she said, cosmic download. And he goes, of course. So it was a really kind of cute thing to witness between the two of them. But anyway, she started basically taking her work. It started and I think this is where she and Kishi got to this level with the work, where after you're doing this type of work for long enough, you start to experience phenomena that you can't explain, right? It starts to expand into a larger field of energy that's informing the energetics of the meridian system, which it's all part of the same thing. But she's starting to get this information and seeing these different things. And that's when she had decided to develop the quantum shiatsu. She decided, well, I want to make sense out of what I'm doing here. So I'm going to go and study quantum physics and use that to explain what I'm doing and to further develop technique based on it. So that was where I started with her and was just absolutely blown away by it. That satisfied me for a very long time. And then when I went to the Zendo finally, at this point she was beginning to open up into working with the chakras and integrating that into the work, she developed terminology for the subtle energy bodies and how that worked with her system. And even started the second year that I went, and maybe the first two, I can't remember, she was starting to even bring in the concept of working with sacred geometry and what she called codes and coding, and integrating that into her work. And it was she got to a point where she felt that it was not in alignment with what was happening at the Zendo. Not in a bad way, but they were tradition keepers in a particular, working in a certain range of energy with its own integrity. And she was now opening up into something that she felt could be in conflict energetically and just wasn't necessarily supported. And out of respect even for that, the energetic of that space, she took it out of that space, which was interesting. So then I was studying with her in her home. And at this point, she was really starting to lose her audience after being one of the most internationally respected living masters of Shiatsu. She'd gotten out there enough that there was a small audience. So when I studied with her in Connecticut in her home, we would just come for the weekend, and she even had students from Europe coming just for a weekend. Those of us that wanted that information would do whatever we had to do to get it, but there were a lot of people that just couldn't resonate. And one of the things, I had mentioned before, that she had decided that she dropped the healing dynamic, that it was no longer about healing anymore, that ultimately that it was really about looking the body through the lens that there's really nothing wrong, and that she did actually think that could be problems even with treating a person as if you're healing, or of course most of
fixing,
and even just that, of course, I think a lot of practitioners, people in healing work, think of themselves as a facilitator, but it was really looking at it as if there really is nothing wrong, and in a sense it's kind of a worldview, but there's nothing wrong potentially with any of it. There's things going on for us to understand and interact with, right? And if we can look at the world a little differently and look at the individual, right? And you're looking at the meridians, right? And saying, okay, what you know to be true is that there is what she called the anti-pathogenic chi, different idea than Jung chi, that it's the chi with the most intelligence. And that if you're looking at that as a frequency of energy that each person possesses as part of, right? It's part of them and they're part of it. That then when you look at the person's energy, you're seeing like, you're looking for the healthiest chi and allowing it to come up into a full expression.
And this is in a particular meridian.
In a meridian, but then it's unifying the whole. The unification is really the objective with that. And using that to work with it, to hook in and let it even transduce some of this other energy that you're working with, these codes and coding or sacred geometry, that it's all there. It's just a matter as the person working with it. And she did use the term like multidimensionality even. But that resonance there, and when I teach about that, it's like saying, to me, it's like this deep form of faith healing, in that you can see a person maybe is expressing some sort of pathogenic experience, but ultimately you know that healthiest, most intelligent vibration of energy is in that person, and all you have to do is tune into that. Right? So you tune into that energy, it comes, and in a sense, you never have to really wrestle around with pathology. That resonance brings it all up into the highest frequency and resolves whatever it is that's going on there, if there's something to resolve. But that you're also saying, I'm respecting where this person is in their life and what's going on with them. So we can say like what's going on as opposed to what's wrong, would be kind of how I would put it personally. So when she got like deep, like further and further, so as I was studying with her in Connecticut, she was getting, bringing in all sorts of different exciting ideas. She started to work with the concept of ascension, and just working with, she was just working with more and more energetic principles, I suppose, if you could say that. And what I've come to realize is that I started studying unified field physics in the last, 3 or 4 years. And that ultimately started to explain what she was getting and how she was hooking in and connecting in with the energetics of the people she was working with.
So one question I had from the webinars, and this is something I've been able to pull over into acupuncture practice and even share with the students at NUNM, seemed practical. I don't know if this was Cliff's own thing or if this came from Pauline. I think it was representative coming from her, this importance of initially assessing the center line. Like you move around to the feet and could just take a quick look, and it's not that subtle a skill, and quick look up. Of course, you're looking at the renmai in terms, but you're kind of putting together seeing and feeling. Where does that not go through? Where is there some kind of hindrance to the center line? This is the connection between heaven and earth that was explained. Why it was important to her, right? It goes back to one of her favorite Tao Te Ching chapters. And so was that something that
I did not get that piece. And by the time I was studying with her, especially that later work, she would have never addressed the body that way. If she would have looked for something that wasn't happening, that was too contractive, would be how she would say. And so it's only into... Yeah, so I don't doubt that she did do that, but she moved past that. And Cliff may have evolved some of that work himself. He did so much with body scanning, but his body scanning was so different than what she was doing, at least at the point I was working with her. They were probably similar at a certain point. And so, she was really, in a sense, what she would say is, you're guiding the session. You're working with different templates of energy that you're guiding, and you're really looking to see that they're working with it. And there's implied free will and choice in all of it. So it's not like you're doing something without consent or something like that. But if they don't want to do it, there's not a problem if they don't want to do what you're doing. She says then you just drop down into your regular Shiatsu model. And it may be for a variety of reasons. It may be they're trying to integrate a previous session and they just need it kind of feeding in through the meridians and integrating that way. Yeah.
And my understanding is at a certain point she was entirely off the body, but that she came back, that the patients had requested that at least one hand be on them. And she could do whatever she wanted with the other hand, but they so appreciated the quality of her touch that they wanted some of that.
Yeah, she did go quite a bit off the body, but so here's an interesting other little note. She stopped working with the meridian system altogether because she was working with a grid. So I'll pretend like there's a person here, but like if you're working along and she would do this faster, meridian work, two-handed work that she developed to basically like speed it up and come into a more expansive phase of energy and activate the light body even that way, right? So you're working faster like this. Then she said, then we started working with an astral grid. And then she started saying, well, now we're going to grid on the body. So she dropped it back down in because she realized we're here in bodies. We're meant to do this. We're not
literally
meant to
grid-like.
Like this. Yeah, like graph paper. Then she would say, look at graph paper, but then it's three-dimensional graph paper, right? But you're going to work like this. There's the grid, and then you're going to grid it in like this. So you're alternating on and off body techniques. So the off body techniques I currently use makes up a very small amount of my session. It happens so fast that it's like I'm not spending tons and tons of time working in the field. I'm spending a lot of time on the body, both doing gridding and meridian work and other types of things in the session. So that was a very different approach. And I don't know where she would have gone next. I kind of think she was going back down and more and seeing. So this, like when you look at that unified field perspective, if it's unified at all scales, right? So you can go from the center all the way out to the borders of the universe and beyond in this sort of, looking at it in terms of the geometry of space-time and even looking at like Buckminster Fuller's approach to that and looking at that, what he called the isotropic vector matrix, meaning a tetrahedral array that connects everything. And then within each tetrahedron, which is in the array, right, is a sphere, which looks just like that flower of life pattern. And that those coordinates and it's kind of to me divine feminine, divine masculine, which is what she would talk about too, is that the spheres being more feminine, the lines and the coordinates, but then you have smaller spheres at those coordinates, right? Anyway, so that you would find the universe all the way down and in. So I kind of think she went all the way out and was finding her way back in, finding that same experience is happening, at the infinitely small level as it is at the infinitely large. And here we exist at our scale, but contained within all of those scales. So I think that's where she was starting to I think that's what was happening, and she didn't have the language for it yet. So,
it's interesting to ask where someone's work would have gone, because unfortunately she passed away.
Right.
I asked the same question of Russell Delman, who was in the second group in the U.S. trained with Moshe Feldenkrais. He said, yeah, really tough to say where his work would have gone if he had lived longer. He said, he thought about it, and he said, well, in the last 3 years he was investigating giving just the most minute stimulus, whereas before it was never gross and muscular, but it had gotten almost homeopathic in the movement input. So he said, I think he would have kept exploring along that trajectory. So you have the experience of being blessed with a teacher that guided you. Then the teacher's gone. That'd be me with dream work,
right?
With Jeremy Taylor being gone for 2 years now. But in acupuncture and bodywork, I haven't experienced losing a mentor. Yeah. So was it 10 years? How long ago did she die?
She died, it's going to be 11 years in the fall. Yeah. So 10.
So what's it like to have a tether and then be...
Right.
You still feel in communication?
I do. And I First of all, she passed away, and it was, of course, shocking. And I mean, we knew she became ill and died in a short period of time. She was as vital as you could imagine a person being the last time I saw her, which was not long before her diagnosis. So it was like pretty shocking. But then when she passed away, it was kind of like, now what? But she was like moving very swiftly on a certain trajectory with the work. She was very interested in what would happen at the end of the Mayan calendar, for instance. I mean, she felt people were...
Is that 2012?
She felt like some really big shifts were going to happen in the consciousness at that point. And I think they did. And so after kind of working through the shock and the grief and the loss piece, I knew that it was upon her students to not stop there. She would say, either you want to hang out in the library or you want to get in the spaceship. That was like a common terminology towards the end of her life, was basically like, she's like, there are tradition keepers, like I was mentioning about.
That's the library.
That's the library. And she's like, we need those tradition keepers. She had total respect, but you either are that or you're not. So I think why I was interested is I was like, I'm going to get in the spaceship, thanks. So I knew I was willing to take on the task to evolve, to take the work to the next level. And I feel that I have, and it's exciting. And it's like, the sky is literally the limit on what is possible with all of this kind of work. And I teach in a way where I try to encourage people to also evolve work, to understand what they're doing and the concepts behind it, because she still had quite a lot of structure in her methods that I still use and teach and feel are
What's
very...
an example of the structure?
An example of the structure would be...
Like, you mean literally starting on the patient's right side or something?
Well, that is a good piece. It is, but also kind of like even the idea of like you're working with it within a template, like so you have a hara map and you're going to use a technique. You want your treatment to match your technique. You don't want to just be drawing in all these different elements from different techniques and trying to put them together. Now, if you do that, be clear about what exactly it is you're doing. There was a lot about being clear and concise, clear angles into the meridian. That was something she was constantly saying. That continues to be true in the energetic field. That we have, even like I was saying, like if I were to do like etheric acupuncture, distal acupuncture, I actually have to like line my angle up to do so. I can't just blab, there's your acupoint, right? It has to go line up exactly with the perpendicular, what they call perpendicular penetration into the meridian, right? So those kinds of pieces stayed relevant, and she utilized them. Mindset was a huge piece, and that keys right into the idea of like, what's your template, what is your intention, and what you're doing. So I don't know, is that a good answer? And like,
yeah, that gives me some ideas.
Yeah.
Structure.
So she had a lot of structure. It wasn't just like go in and see what happens. And you were following. There are protocols too. Like you're really following certain protocols. Once you memorize, right, and kind of download the template of that protocol, then there's room to expand within that, and you understand it well enough to know that when you're pulling in other elements, you understand how they work within it, that it's not random, and that there's a rationale behind why you're doing it, right? She would constantly say, what are you doing and why are you doing that? If she was working with you, you're working on a person and maybe you go rogue for a minute, or maybe you don't understand what exactly she was trying to teach you. She'd come over, I don't teach in this particular, what are you doing? Why are you doing that? And you're like, I don't know, kind of fall apart. I always felt really nervous around her instruction. As kind and respectful as she was definitely to the point. So yeah, there was definitely that piece of it. But it was basically saying you need to be really clear what you're doing and why you're doing it. And then what is that doing? You're observing and watching what's happening in the field, feeling what's happening in the meridians. All of that needs to be happening all simultaneously. So it's an intense training. I mean, you've trained in different kinds of things that take quite a bit of observation and focus to be able to do so, and expansion. That's that she utilized expanding into the peripheral vision, for instance, as like a technique. So it doesn't just give you that, it literally interacts with the other person's field, so that if you look directly at like a hand, you're breaking it down into component parts with a contractive gaze. You open up your gaze, and all of a sudden you have the whole person, and they start to unify. Their field unifies, their physical body unifies, and the information comes through that level of expansion.
Mm-hmm. What Cliff presented in the webinars is this hyper focus was married to dropping her attention into her sacrum.
Oh.
And that the peripheral vision was married to bringing her awareness up to the top of the spine, up occiput. I've experimented with that. It's very clear that's...
And he has done that, where I remember doing an exercise with him where he would kind of have you working through your own spine that way as you expand your vision. I think she mostly got it into just one unified whole piece. But yeah, I think I've seen how that works. And it does open you up this way. And it does change the way a person, I mean, I feel like if we can walk around the world just shifting into that more often, because when you open your peripheral vision up, you're outside of judgment anymore, or outside of that type of, you're not judging spatial relationships. You're not like, what is this? Where am I? What's going on? You're doing it in a more unified way. And it changes. It's if you open your peripheral vision, it's hard to have a judgmental thought, like from that classical judgment, like critical thought, let's say, like critical as in criticizing. But it's very interesting what that does to your whole energetic system, even. So that sets you up for that focus on the anti-pathogenic again, really, because you're not breaking the person down into parts. You're looking at them as a unified field of information.
Did she assess and then at the end of the treatment reassess? So for instance, say you go through the hara and you can feel there's a big area of jaki, yakichi, shiatsu.
Yeah.
Xie, shit.
Yeah.
Well, that's not going to be the meridian with the best energy to work with. So maybe she assesses and she's going to work with Sanjiao. At the end of the treatment, does she go back and check hara? Did that jaki change?
She wants to see that nothing comes up.
Right.
Or something new could come up.
And
but if it does, in a way, you don't want to even engage that, because you're not like, you're done. So like, it's a real quick, in a sense, I feel like I probably do this. Yep, you're done. Like I don't even really want to know. I want to see that there was a change. Yeah, I do want to see that there's a change and there's a unification at that point. I don't actually think I do recheck the hara anymore now that I think about it. I have a closing sequence that's based on like sacred geometry coming out of the navel, and I like put it back. But not put it back, but close and complete, what we've started there, so that they can integrate it, not so that they're not there, so they can integrate it and work with it. But yeah, so she did. And then, I mean, there's different ways that different people have done this, in terms of the faster hara, right? Which
was her way.
Yes. And so when I learned that, now Susan does it different, and I don't even know if Javier does it different too.
His is pretty quick.
Oh, his is quick. I mean, like the recheck. Susan, I believe, goes back through the whole thing, and all I do.
Hav does too.
Right. So all I ever did, and I don't know if I made this up myself or if I got it from her or what, was just real quick. And they're all legit, right? For me, it's like, I don't know why I would do that, because all I do is go to the two, see that they're balanced, or that there's nothing going on anymore, that there's no reaction anymore. You're looking for the absence of the reaction, which is where that anti-pathogenic first expresses through the hara. It's like the reaction between the kyo and the jitsu, which is the over and under functioning, right? They're showing you the anti-pathogenic key, would be what she would say, to the unification, right? So at that level of assessment.
So in the engaging vitality acupuncture style, this is developed by Dan Bensky, Chip Chase, Marguerite Dinkins. And Dan's written an article in the Lantern, the really good Australian journal, about Tong, T-O-N-G. We see this in the core statement in TCM about where there's free flow, there's no pain, or where there's pain, there's no free flow. Well, that's the Tong. Yeah, but he says rather than free flow, we should translate it perhaps as openness. at the end of the treatment, he wants, and Dan Bensky, but I think same for Marguerite and Chip, who passed away a few years ago. They want to see a greater degree of openness between, the body, environment, but between, liver and spleen, liver and heart, just openness internally and between the internal and the external. I try to imagine in my mind what a dialogue between her and Dan Bensky or Chip or Marguerite would have been like. This idea,
Right.
focus on because they're not focused on getting rid of Shiatsu or anything like that.
They're just focused on the, well, so yeah, then your attention is there. That's what you're stimulating, is the openness. So it's just like you're wanting, what you want to have happen with the person, or what is where you want to put your focus. Yeah.
So let's shift. I have a question that's been on my mind for a few weeks. It came up in Austria studying with Alice Wildin and her work with Kishi Akinobu, who was a colleague of Pauline's.
Yes.
And they met through Masunaga, who had been Kishi's teacher and Pauline's teacher.
Yeah.
That Kishi initially called Seiki, he had two names. Sometimes he called it Shinto Shiatsu, but he also at times called it shamanic Shiatsu.
Oh, interesting.
And one of his aims was to rewild medicine,
Oh, right.
to bring an element of the wild in. And this, as I was thinking about this, I stumbled on a YouTube video, Matthew Fox and some others. He's kind of a renegade former Catholic priest, whose work I followed for many years, since the early 80s. He just said one thing, and he was talking about Hildegard von Bingen, the great healer saint of, was it the 1200s or 1100s, sometime around there. And he said, he talked about the sacred. He said, the sacred is wild. It cannot be domesticated.
Right.
Well, you could go in a religious direction with a phrase like the sacred, but Gregory Bateson, his last book, tackled this concept of the sacred, the title, Toward an Epistemology of the Sacred, right, where angels fear. And his definition of the sacred was that with which thou shalt not mess, which is kind of a secular definition. You see, we're messing with putting genes of tomatoes into salmon or vice versa, things that we should never have gotten into,
Right.
or putting 50,000 toxic chemicals in the environment without knowing what's going to happen, and so on.
Yes.
So that's in the absence of the sacred in his definition. So the sacred's not wild, or the sacred is wild, cannot be domesticated. So a lot of people, they would have no problem with the idea of bringing a sacred dimension, whatever that might mean to them, into their work. But if you suggest bringing a wildness in, I think you're going to meet resistance,
Right.
because there's so many theories. Chinese medicine is a scholarly medicine. We've got yin-yang theory, that's two-ness, Sanjiao theory, the three-ness. We've got the Wenbing four levels. We've got the Wuxing for the five. You got the six confirmations for the six. All of these are theories, the things. And then Heiner's, the book he put out, Liu Li Hong, the Yellow Emperor's Transmission of Acupuncture. You see at the end, you end up with basically in where Richard Tong was teaching the system, but they had a clever phrase, identical qi. Kishi was talking about resonance, right? Resonance is the core concept of his Seiki work. So you say, oh, I got a problem here on the Sanjiao, so I'm going to go to the arm, leg, go to the gallbladder, right? So because the gallbladder, according to that book I was just referencing from Liu Li Hong, has got identical qi to Sanjiao. So that's figure outable, right? Right? It's not wild.
No.
Where if you go and study with Dan Bensky, and you go through all these assessments, you find a problem place. then you go through all the other channels to find what most shares a positive resonance with this place.
Yeah.
You can't figure out where that's going to be. There's no theory that
There's not a
guides it.
system that you're applying to it. Yeah.
The system is your awareness. You have to scan all 12 channels, and then you find the one that's most in resonance with the problem place. But then on that channel, is it on the left side, the right side? Is it below? Is it above? You have to find it.
Yeah.
So this is all through palpatory or assessment awareness. That to me seems wild. Because a theory could not have gotten you there. You can't predict, the problem places at the
You
knee.
may be able to backtrack and come up with something, but that's not the basis for the...
That's reverse engineering, though.
Right.
So
Why did I get that?
That seems to me wild. Now, one acupuncturist is a core mentor I won't mention because I haven't asked if I could mention. I asked, did he ever see Kishi work? And he said, yes. And he's very discerning in his positive comments about other people's works. And he said it's very difficult to do spiritual work, he called it, that deep. So just watching him do Shiatsu. So the Kishi is wild because it's just where your hand's going to be. You just have to figure it out. There isn't... Right. Alice says we have habits, but we don't have protocols. Kind of a clever phrase.
Yeah, I like that.
So this idea, because certainly Pauline was closely familiar with Kishi's work. They were colleagues. Where would she have gone with this idea, or your own thoughts as well? This idea, because I think it goes towards the kind of the reemergence of the sacred feminine. I think,
yes, and she was very interested in that.
And you see Hildegard is there.
Yeah, it's funny. I used to exclusively listen to Hildegard in my practice room for years. It's kind of interesting that you bring that up. Yeah. Where would she have gone? I mean, I do get the sense that she did believe there was an organization to all of it, whether you were aware of it or not. So she was willing in a very different way to get the cosmic download and then to do the reverse engineering and figure out what that was about. And that's a lot of how I work, honestly, is I go backwards and go, well, what in the world is this? Something came in, words come in, all sorts of out there stuff comes in. And then when I find out what it actually means, it blows my mind most of the time, which makes me realize we're all just downloading all of it. And that's just a terminology, but we're not storing the information in our brain and we're not necessarily generating it. So whether the person's there feeling their way through and that's
but
their
you have to have
model.
done your work. Otherwise, you're not in a place to receive.
Depends on the person. There are those, I think, that just get it somehow. I've done my work and I do think it's informed. But then at the same time, I do go ahead and research and find out what in the world I'm on to right now. And Pauline, I believe, worked the same way. A little more into the field in that I think it was the opposite direction in a sense, but like I said, I think she was going in, back in again, but we'll see, who knows? We'll see. I don't know what that means.
Kind of related would be Dan Kenner, who was one of the first to study in Japan for acupuncture, graduated in the 70s. He and Peter Thompson and a few others, they were real pioneers of bringing Japanese acupuncture back here. There were no schools here yet in the 70s.
Right.
Where was I going with that? Oh, that he had a story on his old website of his apprenticeship with this acupuncturist who was actually acupuncturist for Buckminster Fuller.
Oh, cool.
Fuller had a hip replacement.
Oh, okay.
And so he had hip pain. Whenever he was in Japan, he would go to this doctor. His name was Mie, M-I-I, Mie Sensei. Mie Sensei's opinion was, and he had studied the classics closely, he said the role of them is not to lay down laws that you dogmatically follow. The role of the classics, properly understood, is to train your intuition.
I like that.
It's most of my Chinese scholar friends would utterly reject that.
Interesting. I mean,
Right,
I use that kind of idea when I teach. Like you've got to download the template, as I keep saying, but it could be, the theory, which is part of the template, is the theory that goes into it, and the map, right? And then once you've downloaded that, you're not thinking about it anymore. And now the information is moving through that template to further, that's the intuition that you're using that kind of guides you through. Yeah, I totally agree with that.
I don't know why it's so provocative to people that I've mentioned it to.
They're in the library.
Yeah. Well, it could be their whole career has been, because the amount of literature in the library here, to stick with the metaphor, is enormous.
Right, and you could just jump into any aspect of it.
Professional ego invested in, I understand this best.
Yeah.
That kind of idea.
And those might be conversations you just say, okay, you're there, I'm here, kind of thing. But still, it's interesting to, I agree with that entirely. And I can also see why that is challenging. If that is, someone's attempting to kind of bust their thing apart.
So I'm guessing that Kishi would not have argued, I don't know, I never met him, that there isn't something figure-outable in the universe, just that you don't have to work in a mental way following that you're
not going to get it without, and you have to actually open up and forget about everything to get it. So it is like this, it's an expansion and contraction, right? So you're going to like open up, and then whatever comes, whether it's to the body, to the universe, to whatever it is, it's all the same thing really. But then you're going to basically allow whatever's going to come through, but it will come through in an organized way. You may or may not know what that is. Yeah. But it does require that you let go of, I don't think any of the like real great minds of all time, I think that's how they did it. I think that's how they all did it, it's not, they had to open up to something.
Certainly the early physicists looking at late 1800s, early 1900s, because what they were encountering was just so mind-bogglingly concept-shattering. Right? It's like, so somehow that generation of physicists, it strikes me as they had to look past, they had the classical Newtonian physics, and that was a straitjacket.
Right.
You couldn't understand what they were encountering.
Right.
Both in the calculations and in the experimental results from that straitjacket.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So they had to have some sort of a process with that to get out of the straitjacket. Yeah, for sure. But I think this is true for artists and for all different levels of what you might, and it doesn't even have to be genius, because I think that kind of feels exclusive. I think this is true for every human being. When they allow it to happen, it does in whatever beautiful way. And it may be something that feels like it's going to mean something to all of humanity, and it may just be a personal moment, but it is that opening up.
Right.
And allowing yourself, and then you use a model like quantum physics to understand the expansion and contraction aspects of that, but you don't have to, and people are doing it without that understanding just fine.
One last thing to talk about.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
If I could grab your rotation.
Oh yeah.
So it looks like a silver toothpick. This is the rotation. So what I want to talk about is space, and this started when I studied with Michael DeAgro, who is one of your colleagues from the Pauline Sasaki quantum Shiatsu community. So we have some advice from classical texts. So pretend this is an acupuncture needle, that all of our attention is supposed to be at the tip, right? Well, that's actually the very definition of contractive.
Right.
So if you get an experience of that, and you can do this experience at home as an experiment, what does it feel like to have all of my attention at the tip, and then do that for a minute, then come back? What does it feel like if I bring in, you could say just the two fingers and the tip of the rotation, or you could say both hands, And you do that, and then you go on, and what about if I feel my hands and then the rest of me and I'm grounded to the earth, but some of my attention is here. And then you go on, and you eventually end up being aware of the space of the room in which you find yourself, and some of your attention is indeed here, some of your attention in your hands. This is a very different experience than the initial one where you're entirely at the tip of the needle. So when I first met Alice, it was a year before I studied with her in Austria. She came to Olympia. This is Alice Wilding, the current teacher of Seiki and co-author of the book with Kishi. She said in her Shiatsu training from day one, space was part of it. She also studied with Pauline. I think Pauline had come to teach at a retreat that Alice's parents ran.
Oh, cool.
So kind of like, here in Oregon, we have various retreat centers. In England, I was one of them. Well, so this importance of a spatial, an engagement of spatial awareness. But then Kuwahara Sensei, great practitioner in Boston, he said, you can go from the tip, though. You can be at the tip, and the tip can be the portal into all that.
Yeah.
Instead of going broad, you can go through here, like going down into kind of, as your shamanic journey, often you'll find a portal into the earth, and something like that. He didn't give that analogy. He said just that here it can open to that. What is your recollection of what Pauline Sasaki had to say about space, or other teachers, or your own thoughts?
Pauline, let's see. Well, I'll tell you my own thoughts, because that, and it's definitely informed by what I've learned from her. For one, with that, I mean, you're just working towards greater and greater expansion. And yet, so with that expansion, say I'm looking at you, and say I were to do like an energy scan, right? If I'm looking at your whole self, I'm still have one point of focus potentially within an expanded thing. So it's not like I'm just blurred out and there's nothing there. It's actually, here's you, and I can look at your shoulder through that focus. And it's kind of like that, right? And so that point is that area is being impacted simply through the vision or with the Tation tool, this, in a specific way based on the expansion, right? But if I were to go right in there and stare right at it, which we talked about earlier, what I think about the portal idea is that you're really looking at like these singularities. So these are those coordinates within the fabric, which are basically little spheres of energy, of space that are not space. They're outside of time and space. They're trans-temporal, non-local events, which are everywhere, infinitely small and infinitely large. We ourselves could be an entirely one whole singularity, right? But you're going into the one singularity, and then you expand into the field of singularities, right? And they're all entangled in their own ways, or potentially, right? So then you're basically just like expanding. It's kind of expansion and contraction at the same time, which you don't ever have one without the other, right? You have the tool to add the contractive element to bring the focus into the one singularity, and then you use your mindset to expand out. I mean, I think Pauline would probably say it similarly, that you're expanding out. I'm kind of adding in some of the like geometry of space-time to like add another element of understanding to it, but just that it's all hooked in, and you're in a field of what they would call like, which is the unified field, but it could also be called like the Akashic field, right? Which would be kind of what you hook into through that shamanic experience, if that's the terminology you use, where you're outside of time and space, and yet it's informing. It's the unmanifest where everything is born of. So then there's unlimited potential within that field, not just in the one point, but how now does that hook into the whole and receive whatever information it needs to.
Yeah, Matthew Fox, I'm recalling in a recent blog, talked about Thomas Berry, who's a great ecological writer. He happened to also be a Catholic priest. The Dream of the Earth was his big book. He had another after that. And this quote, he said, we need fewer priests and fewer prophets. Interesting thing for a Catholic priest to say. And he said, and more shaman.
Oh, right.
And he didn't mean people who go to Mexico and apprentice with someone. He was talking about shaman in a non-anthropological way, really, just as in an extended understanding of the term, as we're discussing here. So this is, as I said, big on my mind. That the space piece was probably 3 years ago, now 3.5 years ago that I met Michael, and that hit me like gangbusters. And it was tragic, really, to have Alice say, well, it was part of my training from day one. And here I was at year 19 or so of my practice life, and no one has talked about space.
Space in that particular way.
Right.
Yeah.
Or space in any way.
I don't know that I started to integrate the concept of space through studying with Resonance Science Academy and Nassim Haramein's work and his whole crew.
Yeah, I follow them on Facebook.
Yeah, and I've gone and studied with them a little bit. I got to go to their resonance retreat in 2019, and I do they have an online curriculum that's free now, which is really exciting. But that work, even Joe Dispenza, I like the way that he talks about space, and it really was like, aha. And so it wasn't really so long ago that the terminology came in, and it started to realize, this idea that we are 99.99999% space ourselves, our physical bodies. And so all of a sudden we become a much different, this energy and the way it differentiates is not so much about the material, even though we perceive it that way, and the physics set it up to, I can't stick my hand through my leg. It's there and lined up in that particular way, but how we can interact with it changes when we start to think differently about that.
So there's a great scholar at the University of Chicago that it's not the history of religion, it's the history of religious experience, Rochia Eliade. And when I was thinking about space and trying to get ready to give a talk at NUNM, their Scholars Hour, I asked this friend who is a professor of anthropology, has anyone written any dissertations on the difference from one culture to another as the concept of space? He said there are hundreds.
Right.
We have nothing to say here in our culture except, here is one noun, here's another noun. Space is this weird empty something between them. We have nothing to say about it other than that. Oops, that's your teaching.
Thank you.
And Eliade's work, he just sent me 30 pages. I eventually bought the book. So like the sacred and the mundane, or vice versa, something like that. And it's absolutely brilliant writing about space. And then the Navajo silversmith who made tools like this one. He's also often a singer in the kind of their ceremonials. He's not the healer, but just kind of joining in and holding space. I asked him about the concept of space in Navajo healing. He said very difficult to talk about, but he said, I'll say we've got 4 sacred mountains. He said for healing to take place, the center has to be invoked. Well, this is exactly in Eliade's book.
Oh, interesting.
And he said, and Eliade, and it's in this one style, Wusheng An from China that Heiner studied with, the center has to spin. Or the dynamic relationship between up, down, it doesn't occur as it should. So uncanny correlation between a Chinese theory and what is known in Navajo healing. And what Eliade kind of, I don't know if he created the term or breathed new life into it, the hierophany. This is a visitation of the sacred into space, as so could be experienced here.
Mm-hmm.
So that if that spinning can occur, there's a sacred dimension.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is what my friend was saying, that a lot of cultures have. He's an expert on Tibet and related cultures, Nepal. But this idea that space is imbued with sacred potential.
Yeah.
It's not just this weird nothing
Right.
here.
No. Mm-hmm.
I got a noun one,
Yeah.
noun two, weird.
Mm-hmm.
We've got nothing to say about it in our culture.
Right.
Other than our culture would say that those traditional cultures are engaging in fanciful thinking, right? It's just made up weird shit, archaic modes of approaching life.
Yeah.
So anyway, that has been, for 3 years now, maybe 4, kind of a big addition to my practice to engage more a spatial awareness as I work.
Yeah. And actually, interestingly, because that was such a part of Pauline's training in terms of the expansion and the alignment, I was surprised going into acupuncture that there wasn't any, until I studied with you and got more understanding of the Japanese approach, there was just no technique to your body as you inserted needles. It was just kind of like, I was like, this is going to be so fun to find out these ways to line my chi up to actually put a needle in a person. And it just didn't exist. And if it did, then nobody was talking about it. Kind of think Hong Jin had something going on with that. But I don't remember her actually teaching it. I could just see it in her. Yeah, but I didn't learn needling from her either. So.
Well, that's a key part of Kishi's work, to find the correct angle and spacing. The Japanese term, I think, ma'ai, something like that. And that also is kind of a transferable piece from the Seiki, and I think it's there in kind of refined Shiatsu styles as well, into acupuncture, as you're explaining. And it's tragedy.
You can infinitely refine an angle. It's like an infinite level of refinement that can happen as you just get more and more lined up and more, and it requires that you open up into the field to do so. In fact, you teach people, here's how you get yourself lined up, and you stand like this and you do like this, kind of like with, Tai Chi and stuff like that. And then after you've programmed that in, then all you have to do is open up into the field and you are instantly get there. I'm like, okay, now you get to here's the cheat in the long run that you will instantly line up. If you open up into the field, you can't be in the field with like this.
Right.
It just won't work.
So you'd be interested that Dan Bensky, this idea, concept of vector of engagement, you can always count on him having a good phrase to imagine this as a guide tube with a needle in it. And imagine you went through a lot of work to find what they call in Japan the presently alive point. And imagine your needle is precisely on it, but then somewhere close to the perpendicular, it won't be like this, somewhere close to the perpendicular, there's going to be an angle, a vector that feels it achieves engagement, right?
And how do you get that? How do you find it?
How do you perceive it?
Yeah.
The hope in the Nanjing is our hands perceive it, but for me, I can't take out a spatial.
Yeah.
See, Goethe said we had many undeveloped senses, hundreds and thousands potentially. And I think there is a different sense that comes here. I could say it's see-feel, but it's actually more feel than see, but seeing is got some kind of role. But see-feel is not seeing plus feeling in some kind of linear addition process. There's some other way of apprehension that is engaged. And so all the students at NUNM learn this now.
Nice.
Just like whether they're arriving at their points strictly by thinking, or they've palpated their way to their points, they're going to take the time to find. They might not take the whole time to find the very best, but they're going to avoid ones that feel bad and find at least one that feels pretty good.
Now here's a thought. What about speed? Because going slow will contract you, right? So if you're spending too much time even feeling, you're getting into a little more of, so that in a sense opens up to this idea that if you were to do it like you're doing it with a little more feeling, a little slower, you're in a certain range, right? This would be getting into Pauline's like sort of 4 levels, that maybe you're getting into like a physical / emotional range. But if you wanted to address maybe more at the spiritual, we could call like more at the Shen level, that you would find that faster and you would go with it. You know what I mean? So you like, it kind of like faster than you can think it, that you know it. So then it's more like it is in the mind and maybe in the heart that you're receiving that confirmation, the yes, which is yes will always feel expansive and good. No to me just feels flat. That was a technique I learned from Pauline, just to get information from another person's energy field. So you just be, even if you go just yes, no, that you've elevated the frequency a little bit, and maybe you're perceiving a different configuration of energy that's you're supporting in that point.
Now, could be, I haven't played with this, but Pauline, you're talking about levels, and you could be wanting to work on a certain level, but maybe it's not the physical level.
Right.
And your orientation could come from that level, not from the normal way that this is taught, which is looking for, because generally in that style you're working on the physical.
Right, and so your technique does match your assessment, right? If you're assessing in this way, then you are kind of treating, and it's sort of assessment treatment at this point in terms of finding the angle, but you've assessed for the point, right? And now your speed is pretty matched up. So you would actually find the information in a different way to match that level too, I suppose.
Let me tell you where I first saw this. Dr. Ma Shou-chun was a great scholar in Seattle, one of the first to come over from China. I saw him treating in the OCOM doctoral program. And I was the only one in the room with him and the patient. And it was a difficult condition. I won't tell the whole case. Well, I'll mention every day, uncontrolled vomiting, uncontrolled diarrhea.
Oh, jeez.
Been to all kinds of experts, no answer. Only 19 years old, had to drop out of school.
Oh my goodness.
Tough life.
Yeah.
And he thought his way to the points. They're not going to surprise you. PC6, stomach 36, CV12, maybe one other point. But then he took 30 seconds to find the presently alive point. And then he put the guide tube on, and I had never seen a Chinese doctor use a red sarin needle, but that's what he used. And he took 30 seconds. He just moved it around so exquisitely slowly. And then he got some kind of he got an inner aha, and then he would really lock it onto that angle and tap it in. One tap, flush to the top of the tube, and he never touched the needle. But I thought, I'm not going to expect much from this treatment, because I was thinking he should do some needle technique. He didn't. He just thought his way to the points. I saw that woman the next day, and she didn't have the herbs yet, because it had been late in the day, Saturday, and the herb room was closed. First time in many months, 24 hours, no vomiting, no diarrhea, nothing even close. So that convinced me, like, ooh, something going on there. And the next module, or 2 or 3 modules down the road, Dan Bensky himself came to teach, and I asked him about it. He said, "Oh, Dr. Ma got that from me." And this idea that comes from his osteopathic palpatory sensitivity, this idea that and you're talking about with Pauline teaching about the the correct angle of
Mhm.
approach into a meridian of
Mhm.
this key. And here, no one was talking about this.
Right.
And most people, if they've got a bunch of years experience in acupuncture, they don't want to hear about it, is my experience.
Right. They're like, I know what I do. I know how to do what I do.
They just want to throw needles in
Mhm.
the way they've been throwing needles in.
Mhm.
But I think they're missing something
A level of refinement with it.
that's the key.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting too because with Shiatsu, the angle, it's again, it's sort of like, it's like the speed, the angle is sort of getting you at that same, getting you to the level. So the cleanest, clearest angle is more expansive and might get into like a more expansive range of frequencies. You would call that like the spiritual level, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if you went into what would an unclean angle look like, right? Meaning you're like actually moving tissue around. It might look a little more like myofascial release, and you get a more local effect, right? Which sort of makes sense. So it's interesting to think about that with a needle, like how they all go in clean, but then there you are more into like a portal in a sense, and how do you get directly to the chi? But what's the angle, I suppose, into I don't know, into like the.
Is he reading an opening in the fascial plane?
Yeah.
That's not discussed. You're just taught to do it.
To do it that way, yeah.
And what's happening, why this angle feels better than this angle, which is only 2 degrees different.
Mm-hmm.
It's difficult to explain rationally. I think there is probably, you could explain it in some way with the fascial plane, but it's a matter of feeling it.
Yeah, feeling sort of for the yes.
Right, some aha-ness.
Mm-hmm. Unification. Like the person.
It's pleasant, actually. It's a difference between unpleasant and pleasant.
And you're working with that person as opposed to trying to struggle with something, struggle through something.
Now, interested, since I'm teaching this in classes, the patient, which will just be a practice partner in a class, they are in complete agreement. Yeah. When the right vector, they'll be like, no, please don't do that. There.
It's like we go in and work with someone's alignment when they're doing Shiatsu, and you might say the most subtle thing about making some kind of a shift, and usually it's the person laying down that first responds to that shift in technique. Oh, wow, that changed everything in some way or another, which is always great to get that feedback.
Right.
For learning. Yeah.
So we're kind of winding down our conversation.
Yeah.
This has been so much fun.
It's been really fun. All really fun stuff to talk about.
I look forward to us filming at least one. I'm thinking 2 continuing ed courses.
Great.
We talked about the 8 extraordinary vessels and maybe an exploration of Hara. Or you can sit with it. Are there elements from your studentship with Pauline Sasaki that are valuable for an acupuncturist? And that could be the whole thing.
Yeah, and there are. I'll think about like how to put that all together. Yeah. Yeah, and also, I think just seeing every point as the singularity and how that, I find it fascinating doing distal work, for instance, that it's an instant change. And I don't think it has to be one particular method. But when you're getting it correctly, you're in alignment, it's because it's working through the field and there's no traipsing through the nervous system or the fascial planes to get there through the body. It's instant information happening. And that is what's been really fascinating me lately. It's exciting to see. Yeah. But there's a lot of potential for what we could do.
Great. Well, we'll put this up on YouTube sometime soon. Just curious, and I'll post it on Facebook to see what sorts of comments we get.
It will be interesting.
Okay, well, thank you so much.
Thank
This has been
you
a
so
joy.
much. Yeah, so great to connect.